My name is Nicolas Servino, and you're listening to the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcast.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to Kinda Sorta Brown. So you're here with your three co-hosts here today, Kurt Nugent,
Rei Bertoldi,
and I'm James Johnson.
So today's episode is a little differently structured from what we normally do. Instead of having a guest and talking about a very specific policy idea or framework, we want to be talking a lot about our backgrounds and sort of our own views that we're bringing to the table in the name of full transparency and disclosure, as well as our own biases, histories, and upbringings. So who wants to get started?
I can get started. So my name's James Johnson. I'm 24, and I'm from Richmond, Virginia, and I identify as a queer black man with a heavy Native American ancestry as well.
Awesome. Tell us a little bit more about where you grew up, James.
So I grew up in what I like to consider South adjacent, but I think everyone else considers Richmond, Virginia to be the heart of the South. But I grew up in an area that was predominantly conservative and predominantly white, but I've kind of, found my own security blankets within that.
All right, Rei, take it away.
Yeah, so I'm Rei Bertoldi. I'm from Los Angeles, California. I identify as mixed race. I'm Japanese and Italian.
Awesome. So where did you grow up, Rei?
Yeah, so I grew up in West Los Angeles, upper middle class, white. I live near Venice Beach, which I've seen a little bit of a gentrification happening in there, but as of now, it's very predominantly white neighborhood.
Okay, nice. So, hey everybody, it's me, Kurt Nugent. I grew up a lot of places. I moved around a lot as a kid. I did the tally the other day and it came out to something like the first 12 years of my life, I moved 11 times, which was kind of bananas, but the place that my family settled down in was Charleston, South Carolina. It's deep south, deep south, pretty irrefutable. There's no, what line are we drawing ourselves here on? We were pretty clearly like Fort Sumter, first shots of the Civil War, weird stuff. Interesting place to be. But I identify as a mixed race individual, specifically Afro-Latino. My mom is Puerto Rico, specifically with Afro and Taino roots. And my dad's a really awesome white dude from New York. So shout out Willie Nuge. So I think something we really wanted to talk about first was, when did we here in the room start first dealing with our identities in a meaningful way?
Yeah, so I guess I can start us off on that. For me, with the biggest part of my identity being black and queer, that wasn't something I really started to deal with until a little bit later in life. I just didn't really have the communities or the outlets to explore the full breadth of my identity until I went away to undergrad. And that was kind of when I first was free enough to actually explore my fullest self.
Growing up, I went to a Japanese immersion school. There were a lot of Japanese students who were clearly Japanese, spoke Japanese, had full Japanese parents, and it was didn't really bond too well with them. And then there were white students who also were kind of felt were the cool girls that I wasn't allowed to be friends with. So that kind of sucked. Yeah, but I feel I didn't really start to really grapple with it until probably college.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really common sentiment or experience specifically for mixed race kids. I think we see, especially during your early childhood and formative years, right, that so much of your identity feels very locked into choices that you have to identify with one group or not another. I definitely felt like I had that experience, especially growing up in the deep, deep South, where so much of race is contextualized in only a binary. And partially that's because, right, there are so many open tensions between Black and African American groups and white communities in the South that other narratives can sort of get lost in sort of the direct tension that exists between those two groups. So as someone who still had connections to, specifically and most openly, the Latino part of my heritage growing up, that was really, really difficult because although my family came into their own and moved into a very upper middle class white neighborhood for the latter part of my adolescence, I never really had the identity specifically because of the opportunity rather, because of my skin tone to choose to really identify with my white side. So I was always identifying as Latino, which makes it for a really interesting place when you feel like you have to constantly justify who you are in the space, because for so many people in the Deep South, even explaining or identifying where Puerto Rico is on a map is such an interesting conversation to even start having.
Yeah, for sure.
So something that you mentioned, I think, Rei, in terms of your own experiencing sort of making choices between your identity, what were sort of the first cognizant choices you felt like you were making?
So I was having a conversation with a friend the other day. I think we were talking about othering and tribalism and how people tend to put themselves into groups of friends, I guess, who were like them. In my own experience, kind of attributing it to like, oh, well, Los Angeles is so diverse. I've always had like a very diverse array of friends. And I was kind of like listing off. I was like, well, if I were to talk about my top 5 best friends, one is Japanese Mexican, one is Pakistani Indian, one is Black Tongan, one is white, and then the other would be my sister, and she's Japanese Italian as well. And I was like, see, look how, diverse this is. And it kind of hit me. I was like, oh my God, I've been othering myself into a group of basically like mixed identifying people and have this whole time been in my own way doing this form of tribalism.
No, I think I find myself, especially, I would have found myself, I think, at a younger age, really, really envious of having that experience because I didn't have that opportunity as a kid. And I think part of that is natural, right, to really gravitate towards people that are like you and understand your experiences. But yeah, I didn't even have the identity that I felt. It was so much later that I don't remember having another Spanish-speaking friend outside of family members on my mom's side till I was 20.
That's so hard because like I don't even know what I would have done without that because it's like a space that you're allowed to exist in. And like I remember in high school I was on the water polo team, which is like, if you don't know, this is the whitest sport of all time.
It's definitely up there.
And I just remember just not feeling comfortable, like not feeling welcome, and like all these white girls and just wanting to be their friends, but like never being able to like break this barrier. And I couldn't imagine, like, I don't know, not having a space where you were able to feel safe.
Yeah, I can definitely speak to that in some degree. A lot of, my circles growing up, I went to a predominantly white Christian school in the South. So there weren't very many black kids, but I still had that community outside of that. So I had all of my family members, I had all of my church friends, but I never really found like a gay community until much later in life. So that was something that I think I can kind of echo some of Kurt's sentiments on that, where it was really jarring initially to be in a position where you can suddenly be your fullest self. So I definitely have appreciated finding that community here at Harris specifically. And I have some wonderful, queer friends here that I love with all of my heart and soul. And it's really, like, interesting to be able to finally, like, explore what that means for you.
Going to college is such an experience. You get to, like, experience new people and new ways of thinking. And I'm just curious, like, how your own college experiences.
Yeah, I think for most young adults, our ages, college is the first time when you get to define yourself completely on your own. So no one that's usually in that space has too much knowledge of who you were prior to coming in, and your parents don't follow you to school most of the time. So they have no like say in like who you're developing into be. So I think for me, I kind of like embraced that opportunity head on and just like went to every event that I could find. So I went to all of the Black student events, all the Native American student events, all of the queer events that I could find, and just kind of like sought to immerse myself in those types of fields. I don't know, did you have a similar experience, Kurt?
Yeah, but I think a lot of that also doubles back in terms of Rei's experience, specifically of like wanting to go to events but feeling a gap between myself and what I would consider like entire or like full ethnically Latin or Black events, which I think it took me a while to even feel comfortable allowing myself to attend a lot of these events. And especially I think that was in part because of my work. My first real connections in Spanish were work relations. So they were people that I worked with, specifically people that I served. And I struggled a very, very long time, like feeling inauthentic that how could I pretend to really connect with such a different group of people, specifically migrant farm workers in North Carolina who are working so hard in terms of tobacco fields, sweet potato fields, and typically here on migrant visas to my extremely privileged from a financial standpoint background, that I would come in there, and even though we spoke the same language, I would struggle with feeling like, how could I claim to represent this group of people when, even though there's so many commonalities, and I found that the group was so much more welcoming than I could have ever asked for, but for such a long time, I was the one putting up barriers for myself to feel really accepted.
How do you go about conquering some of those barriers in your own mind? Because as you mentioned, like the community themselves are very welcoming. So and what steps do you have to take to kind of get over that barrier in your own head?
I think it was really having older friends who had grappled with that for the first time that I looked up to in college, that I did have Hispanic friends who were older that understood not necessarily the experience of being mixed identity or mixed race, but that understood the sense of like feeling really out of place in a space that you were living in and residing in and was supposed to feel secure. And they encouraged me to lean into that a little bit, as well as this is, I think, something that is less typical in college, but I felt that I had somebody who was a really important sort of spiritual figure for me who encouraged me that my identity was like something that for the first time, like I wasn't supposed to be ashamed about, which is, I think, an atypical experience. So I was a lot of different sources, but I found specifically it was almost always people who were older, because I felt, especially because I was an older sibling, that I didn't ever have that growing up, that I felt like I was anchoring my younger brothers, but didn't have other people to turn to. And even though my parents were both super loving and super compassionate, my mom has a more singular identity. So she understands a little bit of intersectionality just because of what it means to be from the Caribbean, that there's so much natural mixing. And my dad is a super compassionate, really awesome dude, but he could sympathize, but I don't think like empathize with some of those issues. And that's not a shortcoming of him. That's just, I think, the reality of not having lived something.
The idea of like you're putting up these barriers, do they exist or are you creating them in your mind? And I feel like I totally relate with that, where I want to relate to you. I want to be like you, but also I'm not like you, and you know that, and I know that you know that, grappling with that. And going back to like the college experience, I remember having a teacher, it was like a sociology class, and we were talking about identity. And I remember asking her like, well, you know, I don't really know what I am. Like, you know, I'm half this, I'm half that. And she stops me and she goes, no, you're not half anything. Like, you are full. You are a full person. Like, you are fully Italian and you are fully Japanese. Like, never forget that. And I remember just being like, holy shit, it just like blew my mind. And I was like, yeah, like these barriers are kind of like barriers that we've put up for ourselves because we don't feel like whole enough, basically. But actually it's like, no, you are wholly this identity while being multiple identities, which is kind of interesting.
Awesome. So we're going to take a super quick break and we'll be back with some more riveting conversation.
Chicago. The Windy City, the city of broad shoulders, the second city, is complicated.
Known for its legacies of segregation and political corruption, Chicago has a lot to grapple with.
On Chicagoland, we bring you conversations with activists, journalists, politicians, and others who are working to address these issues.
You can find Chicagoland wherever you listen to podcasts.
From University of Chicago Public Policy Podcasts.
This is Chicagoland.
Yeah, so I'd actually really love to give a shout out and specifically introduce someone who's been super crucial to the development of our podcast. So I'd give a round of applause, but I think that would sound terrible in the mics. So give it up hypothetically for Izzy.
Hey, everybody. So I'm Izzy. I've been producer with the team here. And so it's been really happy to work with all of them. Kind of chiming in on the conversation about college and finding about identity. So growing up, I went to really just very homogenous neighbor community. I lived both in New York area and then Chicago area, both times in pretty affluent white Jewish communities, and went to Jewish day schools between first grade through 12th grade. So basically coming to college was the first place that I really, outside of sports teams, it's like the rec league sports teams, or outside of some family friends, but not really particularly. Like, it was the first time I was really becoming both school and working relationships, and then even friendship relationships with people of color, people of different faiths than me. I remember even my roommate, freshman, sophomore year, I would just like throw around Jewish terms in Hebrew just because it was what I was so much used to from what I grew up. And it was that process of kind of learning a little bit about how other people interact. And not that I've experienced any discrimination or anti-Semitism, at least I didn't feel that so much myself, but that it's just teaching people about my identity and then really much learning about other people's identities and learning how to kind of speak the right language or speak the right way to engage and learn about and then get really passionate about equity and racial identity and et cetera. And one other thing and I'm going to bring it out, a question back to you guys, is that at the same time as I really tried leaning into exploring other identities, exploring other communities, for the first half of college, I really felt like I was missing something, that I wasn't very much involved in the Jewish community at all. I went to services, but wasn't involved in any really active way that made it feel like a place of my own. And so to begin my junior year, I really intentionally chose to get back involved in the Hillel on my campus. And kind of that became where I made some of my best friends, some of like the most important, meaningful community to me. So kind of question for you guys is, at the same time as you're playing with your identity or trying to figure out these different spaces, James, as you were saying, going to all these different events, was there some place that became kind of a center for yourself? And you can think about that in college, life since, maybe here at Harris.
So I would say that first big place that became home for me was my undergraduate group of friends. Like I mentioned prior, they had no knowledge of who I was prior to coming to UVA. So they didn't know me as the, top student in like the Christian school that I went to or the star student in Sunday school. They just kind of got to know me as who I presented to them initially. And so we still joke about it like to this day. But all of my undergrad friends like remember the times that I came out to them and how scared